Hello. Right, okay, so hi everybody. We've just hit the 10-2, so I bet we better get started with it. Only one of the screens seems to be working, so I hope you can see it. I hope I've done it big enough for everybody to see on this side. My name is Daniel White. I'm from Northumbria University, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a project that I've run on quality management systems within EAP. Just to give a little bit of background on this, what I mean by quality management systems is looking at this holistically, so looking at a broad range across quality control, quality assurance, and on quality enhancement as well. In terms of the wider information, sorry, I'm just starting my stopwatch so I can gather where I'm at. Right, the wider sector and what's been happening with higher education. The Bologna process around about 20 years ago kind of started this idea of standardisation within higher education across the board, and that has led to kind of European standards being developed at each level in terms of what skills students need to demonstrate, and as you will all be aware, has kind of ushered in this era of kind of metrics and results-based kind of work. That's then brought us to the UK standards, which was by QAA, which were the designated quality body at the time, and the framework for higher education qualifications. And again, with all your institutions, you'll be aware of this. A lot of institutions then use these to base their own internal quality assurance frameworks upon. And the idea of this is to set and maintain standards across the board and across Europe, and that is actually being rolled out as well and being developed more internationally. In terms of EAP, then, quality management processes largely appear to sit outside of a lot of the national frameworks. Now, we do also have these internal frameworks that we mentioned here, where EAP would be based, and this study is no exception. A lot of the institutions that are in this study all went through internal processes with quality assurance, and it was all relatively robust and stringent as well. You've also got externally, you've got accreditation schemes. So you've got British Council, which is more ELT related. You've got BALEAP, which is more focused on EAP specifically. But not everybody is in the BALEAP accreditation scheme at this point. And one of the more influential kind of models, not a framework as such, but in terms of kind of approach, was the CHEM model. And this was particularly influential for in-sessional, in the focus of contextualization and embedding and mapping provision across students' programs. But that was really focused on principles and what we do, but not really focused on how we go about doing it. There was also no real focus around how that's measured and what success looks like either, although there were kind of there was information about kind of perception and student experience and so on. And later a balanced scorecard was added to this model, but again, the focus on how to do this is something at the moment that's a little bit of a gap, I would say. So my study then looked at really just trying to learn what was going on in the rest of the sector within EAP, and trying to identify how challenges and opportunities might arise from speaking across different institutions. I then invited senior managers in EAP to semi-structured interviews. There was 11 institutions overall took place, 2 of which were so different in terms of context to the others, so I've discounted those from the actual analysis. And I've used content analysis to understand and interpret the data. Now, the structured interviews themselves were based on this CIPO model of education, which focused on context, which can include frameworks and skills and so on. Frameworks internally and externally, and input, which focuses on institutional strategies, but also looks at things like budget and the qualifications of staff who have been recruited. We also had process, which is the more design-related aspects, so program design, assessments, content, and so on. And then you've got output, which focused on measurements. So what does this mean? What is success? Now, this kind of brings us to speaking through, I've rushed through that really quickly, to the results and the discussion. Just to give you a little bit of information on this before we start. First of all, I mentioned those internal frameworks. All institutions had one, and as I said, they were relatively robust. So there was student feedback was used, there was peer observations, all of the things that you would expect from general quality assurance, and all of that seemed to work relatively well to an extent. What I was particularly interested in is some of the information that came out from underneath or underlying some of the comments that were made. And what I've done is identified 5 main themes, and I'm going to present them based on a quote that sums up that particular theme. I'm going to show you some quotes from it, which you might not be able to all read within the time I'm going to be speaking about it, but I'll try to sum that up, or I'll have some little kind of comments at the bottom to help you to interpret what the important bits are. Or there's some bits in bold as well for you as well. So, theme number 1. The first theme was around strategic alignment. Now, this might first say, it's talking about mission statements here. Okay, there is a mission statement, but it's not made clear to us. This isn't in relation to kind of the centre leadership or anything like that. Okay, this is really in terms of strategic alignment to the wider institution. So a lot of the interviewees were talking about how it wasn't really clear to them how they contributed to the strategy. It's explicitly. And in terms of what comes out of this, we've got a potential lack of institutional strategic alignment. Now, we're all aware of the conversations and the literature around uncertainty about language centres and where they fit. Lots of moving around, lots of restructures, and lots of conversations about marginalisation and so on and so forth. And this, I would say, this kind of feeds into that quite a lot. It also potentially leads to this a potential misperception of EAP as a result. And of course, without any strategic alignment, or without clear strategic alignment, can't say it, it's difficult to understand what success is. Second theme, okay, this one initially, I'm going to focus on pre-sessional first because it seems more prevalent, but it does all tie in to the overall picture towards the end. The second theme is the primary purpose is X, but I mean for us the purpose is Y. Now this was around the perception of what we do. It's about identity, I guess. And the comments around pre-sessional were kind of, the purpose of pre-sessional is to get students up to the level. That's the whole reason that the students are there. And everyone was, when asked about the purpose of it, would say the exact same thing. So students are there to learn English. But many saw it as more than this. And I'm sure we all probably do as well. But if you look at the language in bold there, so I suppose that's the primary reason, but I mean, for us, the purpose is to, and the focus was on preparing students for their degree programs, more specifically, so not just English language. And how they did that, or what the focus of that was, many in the interviews were talking about this potential pendulum shift from language towards more study skills or academic skills or literacies, competencies, whatever you want to call them. Even to the point where one of the interviewees, a pre-sessional program leader, stated that they would quite like to, in a way, ditch the language, the language element of the program altogether, which of course kind of defeats the initial purpose that we're aware the students are going there for. So there's this potential pendulum shift towards study skills. And when asked why this was, pretty much everybody talked about time frames. They talked about realistic time frames to get from A to B in terms of language level. So we can't do this in 6 weeks and so on, 6 weeks and so on and so forth. Now, this actually is, I would argue, is a wider trend as well. Okay, there's probably something else going on here. I would argue. You could pick this out of any literature. I've picked this out of just one particular one. This was a neighbouring university, Steve Kirk from Durham, and in the thesis for him, he's talking about university, again, it's about offering a pre-sessional program to those who don't have the English language skills. However, for those teaching and working in the program, the purpose and remit is wider. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second, okay? The impact then of this, let's focus on pre-sessional for a second. There's a lot of, we don't know, obviously, what the factors are involved in this, but there's a lot of research to demonstrate that pre-sessional programs, students who attend pre-sessional programs tend to perform less well than students entering directly. Now, we don't know whether that's language related at all, and it's very difficult to determine without further research. But it's something, I think, for us to consider. The second point was around pre-sessional students and perception generally. A lot of the literature is around understanding attitudes towards or experience towards certain provision. So former pre-session students, there is research to show that they're more confident when they go into the programs, but that's not necessarily borne out in outcomes. And the third one was around student expectations as well. You know, students do expect more explicit grammar and vocabulary work, and when they get onto the programs tend to be quite surprised when that's not the case. So those are just potential impacts for pre-sessional. But let's think about kind of how this kind of ties in and whether there's something more to this idea of this pendulum shift potentially. When we start talking about the word, this idea of internationalization, a lot of the interviewees were talking about this idea of recruitment. So there's a perception among many that internationalization was mostly about recruitment, and that when international students arrived onto campus, there was additional support given, and they were treated as deficient or as a deficit model. But the learning and teaching on other programs didn't necessarily evolve. So we were seen there as given remedial support to help these particular students. Now, what I would say with that is this, for me, this kind of underlies a bigger picture. Higher education institutions tend to lack explicit embedded teaching on how to learn. A lot of the things we're asking students to do, they don't get specific provision for it. They seek it out. International students are very lucky in the fact that there are EAP tutors that often are embedded into programs and they get the additional support. But as a result of this, what you've found is that there's gaps in learning and teaching within higher education. As tutors who focus on needs generally, we've seen this, we try to address this, and as a result, EAP tutors have kind of self-defined themselves, which has left us kind of in this position where EAP is actually EAP with a small e. And often, there's a misperception of what that EAP is still English language support. And I'm sure you've all probably had those experiences. Third theme, I don't really know what others are doing. We all do our own thing completely. Okay, now this was around about isolation. Okay, so this was working on, a lot of the comments around about in-sessional for this actually, but it was kind of, okay, I'm working on this program, I'm working with this program leader, this module leader. I don't really know what my colleagues are doing. Or we're all doing something different, but we've all got the same aim. So the focus on this was around about this idea of potentially duplicating teaching, not really understanding what provision is going on programs, at the library, with employability skills, this overlap of skills, and this idea of potentially reinventing the wheel. We're all doing the same thing, we've all got the same aims, and as we've established, the skills that students need to demonstrate at each level is standardised. So why are we reinventing the wheel is the point. And many then also mentioned that there wasn't really any particular curriculum for them to hang this on or base it around. Obviously, we've got things like Common European Framework, but what do we do when it comes to in-sessional? It becomes about programme needs, it becomes about module needs, and that might differ from programme to programme. So what I would say with this is that the mapping student needs against programme needs is a challenge, and this is probably where it gets a bit more contentious. EAP, by its very definition, is about needs analysis. Student needs and institutional needs or programme needs. I would argue that actually that's probably a disadvantage using that as our primary definition. It's very, very important, but there needs to be something else. That's what I would personally argue. What I would say is that basing everything on needs analysis leads to variation. So that can potentially mean overall quality is different. It can be brilliant in some areas, but it can be lacking in others. So it's about kind of overall quality. It also means it's very difficult to monitor or measure what we're doing in any meaningful way because you haven't got strength in numbers in that respect. And also a potential lack of coherence. As I've mentioned, what I mean by that is kind of duplication across different services within an institution. Fourth, I'm going to skip through these ones relatively quickly. Fourth one, I don't feel confident with assessment design. Okay, so this was really just about, especially when it comes to something like pre-sessional. Many were concerned that they were tasked with writing assessments. They didn't really know whether it was, or they couldn't really confirm whether it was robustly or reliably mapped to language levels. So it was a lot of it was kind of best guess, and it was based on intuition or was based on experience. So again, a lack of framework or a lack of clear kind of national curriculum results in potential variability in quality in terms of assessments, and lack of expertise and confidence makes it difficult to determine accuracy of assessments. And the final theme was around outcomes. Many expressed this idea, asking them, you know, how do you measure what you do? Well, we would really like to do that, but it's very difficult to do so. We've tried this, we can't get this information, and so on and so forth. So many outlined that they were unable to get the information they needed to really understand what was going on with students. So the understanding of outcomes and impacts is challenging, and that, again, misses opportunities to understand overall quality. So, conclusions. In terms of context, there isn't really any framework that best fits what we do. We've got Common European Framework, we've got the QAA framework for higher education qualifications and so on. Doesn't all fit. Even the accreditation schemes that we mentioned earlier tend to focus on things like teaching competencies. So we haven't really got anything to map to as such. In terms of input, there's a general lack of clear direction from institutions in reference to what the purpose is overall. How does it feed into the overall university strategy? Process, the big takeaway for me on this one was around the fact that learning and teaching doesn't seem to have evolved as much as it probably could have when international students have joined universities. As a result, we have then seen those gaps as EAP tutors, and we've started to try and do everything. We want to help the students, we recognise the things that we need to prioritise, but as a result of that, we end up self-defining ourselves, and then others don't really understand what we do as part of that. The dual purpose of EAP, this idea of English and study skills, obviously they are interlinked and you can't really break them apart, but it potentially is problematic. If there's no framework in which to base the design of programs or assessments on, then it results in a lot of variation, even though we're all trying to do the same thing. And then a lack of standardisation creates difficulty for assessment design as well in terms of outcomes. Without any standardisation, it's very difficult for us to measure what we do in any meaningful way. Recommendations then. More dialogues required around a clear purpose for EAP at an institutional level. Also potentially together as a group as well in the sector. In terms of the broader scope there, though, we're talking about this idea of framework, and I would argue that there are opportunities for us to develop a universal skills framework on which we can start to base all of our design of programs. For pre-sessional, I would argue that there are more extreme kind of possibilities with this, not necessarily saying we should do this, but these are possibilities of designing potential national curriculum. Again, you know, we're all aiming at B2 level. Is there something that we can do that minimises the amount of work that we're doing and increases quality at the same time? And also even potential for centralised assessment design, which means we can have more confidence in the reliability and the robustness of the assessments that we're using. In terms of skills framework that I mentioned earlier, at Northumbria, what we're trying to do now is we're starting to identify all of the skills required across all services. And we're trying to think, is there a way that we can develop a holistic framework that would allow us to then start to have greater coherence and transparency for students and for staff, and for us to start to personalise the support for students as well, through things like personal tutors and so on. And that kind of brings us to the end. In terms of limitations, the one thing I'll pick out, there's a few on the slide there, is just around, I'm going to pick up this last one here. This was very holistic. Okay, I was kind of just exploring what's going on and what were the potential opportunities here. And there would be more opportunity for us to kind of drill down on this and identify and do a bit more research on it. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? There's references here. I'm sure we're going to share the slides, I guess. Yeah?